The cold December rain had settled into the streets of Seattle, tapping gently against the windows of Eleanor Whitfield's two-story house. The glow of holiday lights strung across her porch should have made the home look cheerful, almost welcoming. But inside, Eleanor sat in her favorite armchair by the fire, staring at a letter that had arrived earlier that morning. Her hands trembled slightly as she unfolded the thick ivory envelope. The words inside were beautifully printed in calligraphy, yet every syllable cut like glass. Dear family, we invite you to join us for the marriage of Claire Whitfield and Daniel Hayes on December 18th. Her eyes skimmed the details of the wedding, the grand hotel downtown, the candlelit reception, the photographs promised in glossy spreads of joy and celebration. But there was one thing missing. Her name. Eleanor was not listed among the invitees. She hadn't even been addressed directly. And yesterday, in a brief, dismissive phone call, her eldest daughter, Margaret, had confirmed it. "Mom, I think it's better if you don't come," Margaret had said, in a tone too practiced, too cold. "You know how much tension you cause. Claire just wants peace at her wedding." "Tension," Eleanor had repeated, clutching the phone as though she could squeeze sense back into her daughter. But the call had ended, leaving her with silence and the insult echoing in her mind. Now, sitting by the fire, she stared at the flames and felt her chest ache. For 80 years, she had carried this family on her back. She had sacrificed holidays, endured grief, and built a home where her children could feel safe. She had cooked meals, wiped tears, worked 2 jobs when her husband fell ill, and held them together when his death left a hole no one else dared to fill. And yet here she was, cast aside like a stranger, banned from her own granddaughter's wedding. Her lips pressed into a thin line as she folded the invitation carefully, sliding it back into its envelope as if handling something poisonous. They thought she was powerless now. They thought she had grown old, fragile, irrelevant. What they didn't realize was that Eleanor still held something they desperately needed. Her late husband, Richard, had been a meticulous man. When he passed, he left behind not only his business accounts, but also a carefully crafted family trust. And as executor, Eleanor was the one with final approval over distributions. Without her signature, the money remained locked. The grand wedding Claire and Daniel had planned, with its glittering chandeliers, expensive catering, and lavish floral arrangements, was all built on the assumption that Eleanor would simply sign the checks without question. She hadn't, and she wouldn't, not yet. Eleanor rose from her chair, the envelope still in her hand. Her joints ached, but her steps were steady as she crossed the living room. On the mantel above the fire sat a framed photo of her late husband. His eyes, sharp even in age, seemed to watch her with approval. "They've forgotten who I am, Richard," she whispered, "but I'll remind them." The decision crystallized in her chest like ice. She would not be erased. If they wanted her gone from the wedding, they would have to face the truth. Without her approval, there would be no wedding at all. To be continued in the rest of Section W. Here, I'll expand with sensory detail, family flashbacks, foreshadowing, and the dramatic reveal of her leverage. Eleanor did not sleep that night. The fire in the hearth had long burned down to embers, but her mind refused to rest. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw the faces of her children, Margaret, Henry, Claire, and the quiet disdain that had crept into their voices over the years. She remembered birthdays when they arrived late, holidays when they left early, and phone calls that grew shorter and less frequent. And now this an outright banishment, as though she were some troublesome relative rather than the matriarch who had built the very foundation beneath their lives. By dawn, the rain had stopped, and the city wore a sheen of frost. Eleanor brewed herself a pot of black coffee, the aroma filling the kitchen with bitter warmth. She set the cup down at the oak table Richard had built decades ago, then pulled out a folder from the sideboard. Inside lay the documents of the Whitfield family trust. She ran her fingers across the thick pages, tracing the embossed seal at the bottom of the legal letterhead. Everything was here: the assets, the bank accounts, the disbursement schedules, and at the heart of it, her authority as executor. Her children had either forgotten or underestimated the significance of her role. Perhaps they thought the trust would simply unspool on its own, releasing funds without question. But Eleanor knew better. Every dollar required oversight. Every transaction passed under her pen. Without her approval, not a single cent could leave those accounts. She thought of Claire, her granddaughter, sweet as a child, mischievous with her bright eyes and endless questions. Eleanor remembered baking cookies with her in this very kitchen, the little girl's giggle ringing like bells as flour dusted across the countertops. When had that bond faded? Was it Eleanor's fault? Or had the seeds been planted by Margaret's constant whispering, her talent for turning children against their grandmother with subtle words of poison? The coffee had gone cold before Eleanor realized she was still holding the mug. She placed it carefully back on the table, then stood, her resolve hardening with each breath. She would not sign a thing until they showed her respect. If that meant halting the wedding, then so be it. Perhaps only the shock of consequences would awaken them to the truth. Later that morning, Margaret arrived unannounced. The sound of her luxury car's tires crunching over the frosted driveway stirred Eleanor from her thoughts. She watched through the lace curtains as her eldest daughter stepped out, impeccably dressed in a beige coat, her posture stiff with the arrogance Eleanor had grown used to. Margaret didn't bother knocking politely. Instead, she rapped sharply on the door, as though issuing a command. Eleanor opened it slowly. "Well," she said coolly, "this is a surprise." Margaret swept inside, removing her gloves with quick, agitated movements. "Mother, we need to talk," she said. Her tone carried no warmth, only urgency. "About the wedding?" Eleanor asked, closing the door behind her. "Yes, about the wedding," Margaret snapped. She dropped her gloves onto the table, her eyes scanning the kitchen until they landed on the folder of trust documents. For a moment, her carefully composed expression faltered. "You haven't signed them yet?" "No," Eleanor replied, her voice steady. "I haven't." Margaret exhaled sharply, as if dealing with a stubborn child. "Mother, do you understand what's at stake? The venue has been reserved, and the vendors are expecting payment. If those funds don't clear this week, the entire ceremony is at risk." Eleanor folded her arms. "So I've heard. But tell me, Margaret, if I'm not welcome at this wedding, why should my money be?" Margaret froze. The color drained slightly from her face before a flush of irritation returned. "This isn't about you. This is about Claire. She deserves her perfect day, and I don't deserve respect." Eleanor's voice cut through the air like a blade. "I raised you, Margaret. I buried your father alone while you hid in your career. I kept this family afloat when you could barely stand on your own 2 feet. And now you tell me I'm not part of this family." The silence that followed was heavy, broken only by the ticking of the old clock on the wall. Margaret's eyes flickered, searching for words, but none came easily. "You'll sign it eventually," Margaret muttered finally, her voice low and tight. "You wouldn't ruin your granddaughter's happiness." Eleanor stepped closer, her gaze unyielding. "Wouldn't I? If my presence is such a threat to her happiness, then perhaps she should try marrying without my approval. Let's see how far that gets her." Margaret's jaw tightened, but she said nothing more. She snatched her gloves from the table and stormed toward the door, her heels striking the wood floor in sharp beats. Before leaving, she turned back once, her eyes hard. "You'll regret this, Mother." Eleanor stood in the doorway long after Margaret's car had disappeared down the street. Her heart was pounding, but her resolve was stronger than ever. They thought she was weak, but they had forgotten power doesn't always come from youth or strength. Sometimes it rests in the steady hands of the one holding the pen. And Eleanor wasn't about to let go. The winter sun sank early over Seattle, casting long shadows across Eleanor's kitchen as she sat staring at the stack of envelopes spread before her. Some bore her name, others were addressed to her late husband, and a few were marked with the family's surname only. They were invitations, bills, and notes that once brought comfort, now mixed with cold silence. The invitation to her own granddaughter's wedding sat on top, glaring back at her like an insult carved in fine calligraphy. She read it again and again. The elegant script said, "Mr. and Mrs. Jonathan Hill request the honor of your presence at the marriage of their daughter, Claire Hill, to Matthew Brooks." No mention of her name. No recognition of the woman who had helped raise Claire when her parents were struggling to build careers. It was like she had been erased. Eleanor's hands trembled slightly, but not from age alone. Anger simmered beneath her composure, a storm that she had kept hidden for too long. The message was clear. They didn't want her there, not without her compliance, not without her silence, not without her approval, being used as a convenient stamp and nothing more. Her mind drifted back to when Claire was 6 years old, running through the very same yard in a pink dress, carrying a basket of wildflowers Eleanor had helped her pick. She remembered holding her hand on the first day of school, whispering words of comfort while Claire squeezed her fingers tight. She remembered baking cookies late at night because Claire couldn't sleep, and how they had sat together in the glow of the oven light, laughing like two conspirators against the darkness. And now, years later, that same little girl had grown into a woman preparing to walk down the aisle. Yet somehow, she had been convinced that her grandmother no longer belonged. The ticking of the old grandfather clock filled the silence of the house. Each tick reminded Eleanor that time was moving forward, that Christmas would soon come, that the wedding was drawing closer. And each tick carried a bitter truth. They thought she would do nothing. They thought she would simply sit here, silent and forgotten, while they planned a future that excluded her. But Eleanor was not a woman built for silence. She had endured wars, recessions, and the painful loss of her husband. She had been the keeper of the house, the balance of the bank accounts, and the executor of every major decision in the family. They had relied on her for decades, but now they had conveniently forgotten one detail. The foundation of their plans still rested on her signature, her approval, and her resources. That night, she pulled out the old lockbox from beneath her bed. The combination dial clicked into place with familiar resistance. Inside were the documents that carried true weight: the original deed to the family's ancestral cabin, the legal proof of her ownership of certain funds, and most importantly, the trust documents her husband had left her with explicit instructions. She read his handwriting once more, neat and unwavering even in his final years. Eleanor, remember, control is not about force, it is about patience. They will forget, but you will remember. Her chest tightened. She wasn't doing this just for herself. She was doing it for him, for the memory of the man who had believed in her strength, and for the legacy that would not be rewritten by selfish hands. The next morning, the phone rang. It was her daughter-in-law, the sharp tone, unmistakable. "Mother Hill," the voice began, "I hope you understand that the seating arrangements are very tight. It might be best if you simply watched the ceremony online. That way you won't have to travel, and it'll be easier for everyone." Eleanor closed her eyes, gripping the receiver until her knuckles whitened. Watched online. They weren't even ashamed of how cold they had become. "I see," she said slowly, her voice calm yet cutting like ice. "You've made many decisions without me. But tell me, have you already spoken to the bank about covering the expenses of this wedding?" There was silence on the line. Then a nervous laugh. "Well, we assumed the trust would take care of that, as it always has." "Yes," Eleanor replied, her lips curving into the faintest trace of a smile. "The trust, which I control." She ended the call before her daughter-in-law could respond. As she set the receiver down, Eleanor felt the fire return to her veins. They thought she was powerless, but soon they would learn that every choice they had made depended on the very woman they had tried to erase. And as Christmas lights began to twinkle across the neighborhood, Eleanor knew one thing for certain: this holiday season would not go the way her family expected. The days leading up to Christmas passed with a strange quietness in Eleanor's home. Outside, the streets of Seattle glowed with lights strung across rooftops. Children dragged sleds across small patches of snow, and shop windows filled with decorations promised warmth and togetherness. But inside her house, the atmosphere was different. It wasn't loneliness exactly. It was resolve. Every ornament she placed on her tree, every wreath she hung, felt like preparation for a battle of dignity rather than a holiday of joy. She polished the silver candlesticks her husband had given her on their 30th anniversary. She baked gingerbread cookies, the way she and Claire once had, though she knew none of her family would come to share them. She lit candles in the evening, letting the shadows dance across the walls as she sat with the trust documents spread before her. Each night, she studied them as though they were sacred texts, whispering lines under her breath until she could recite them without looking. By the time the 23rd of December arrived, Eleanor was ready. She had made an appointment at the bank, arranging to speak directly with her late husband's attorney, a man who had worked with the family for decades and understood exactly how much authority she still held. She dressed carefully for the meeting: a dark green wool coat, a pearl brooch, and leather gloves that had belonged to her mother. She wanted to walk in with the appearance of someone underestimated but unshaken. The attorney, Mr. Whitman, greeted her warmly, though with the guarded professionalism she expected. "Mrs. Hill," he said, motioning for her to sit, "I've been wondering when you might come in. I suspect this is about the trust and the wedding." "Yes," Eleanor replied firmly. "My family believes they can push me aside. They've forgotten that every major disbursement still requires my approval. I intend to remind them." Mr. Whitman adjusted his glasses. And you have every legal right to do so. The trust was established with your authority in mind. Without your signature, the funds cannot be touched. Not for the wedding, not for anything. A calm satisfaction spread through Eleanor. She signed the documents that would temporarily freeze any new withdrawals from the trust until after Christmas. It was not out of spite but out of necessity, to make them pause, to make them realize they could not erase her while depending on her generosity. When she returned home, the phone rang again. This time it was her son, Jonathan. His voice was softer than usual, but the tension was obvious. "Mom, Claire's upset. She thinks you're angry with her. The wedding is only weeks away, and while I heard from Whitman that the funds are locked. Is that true?" Eleanor listened in silence, letting his words pile on top of each other like snow on a rooftop. Finally, she spoke. "Yes, Jonathan, it's true, because I will not approve anything until I am treated with the respect I deserve. I am not an afterthought. I am not a silent wallet in the corner. I am your mother, and I will not be erased from this family." Jonathan exhaled sharply. "Mom, you don't understand. Claire wants things a certain way. She's under a lot of pressure." "And what about me?" Eleanor shot back, her voice trembling now with both anger and heartbreak. "Do you think I have not been under pressure all my life? Do you think raising you, keeping this family's stability, burying your father, and carrying his legacy was easy? I stood by every one of you when no one else would. And now you tell me I'm not wanted at Christmas, that I can't attend my own granddaughter's wedding. If that is how you feel, then fine. But do not expect me to sign away my power to fund my exclusion." The line went quiet. She could almost hear Jonathan's pride crumbling on the other end, but he wasn't ready to admit defeat. "We'll talk about it later," he muttered, before hanging up. That night, Eleanor stood at her window, looking out at the Christmas lights blinking across the neighborhood. She thought of the children she once watched from this same window, the neighbors who had long since moved away, the decades of laughter and heartbreak that had unfolded within these walls. She felt the weight of history pressing down on her shoulders, but also the strength of it. This was not just about money or invitations. It was about dignity, memory, and the truth that a family's roots cannot be severed by convenience. On Christmas Eve morning, Eleanor decided to attend church, something she had not done regularly since her husband's passing. The pews were filled with families, couples holding hands, children whispering excitedly about presents. Eleanor sat quietly near the front, listening as the choir sang hymns that stirred her heart. For the first time in weeks, she felt a deep peace, not because her problems were solved, but because she knew she dared to face them. When the service ended, an old friend approached her. "Eleanor," she said kindly, "I've heard a little about what's happening. Don't let them take your joy. Sometimes children forget the hands that raised them, but Christmas has a way of revealing truths. Stand tall." Eleanor smiled faintly, tucking the words into her heart. As the bells of the church rang out, Eleanor knew that her family would be forced to come to her, sooner rather than later. They had built their celebrations and their future on foundations she still guarded, and she was prepared, not to punish, but to remind them of the woman they had underestimated. The holiday was not over yet, and neither was her fight. Christmas Eve settled over the city with a soft hush, the kind of quiet that only comes when snow falls gently and steadily across rooftops. Eleanor's house glowed with warm lamplight, its windows frosted over, while carolers could be heard faintly in the distance. She sat by the fire, sipping tea, staring at the flames, and listening to the ticking of the grandfather clock in the hallway. Each tick seemed to echo louder than the last, reminding her that the confrontation she had delayed for weeks was no longer avoidable. At precisely 7 o'clock, headlights washed across her driveway. Eleanor didn't need to look outside to know it was Jonathan and Claire. She stood, smoothed the folds of her sweater, and prepared herself. When the doorbell rang, she opened it calmly. The cold rushed in, along with the sharp scent of pine and snow. Jonathan looked tense, his jaw clenched. Claire, wrapped in an expensive white coat trimmed with fur, held herself with the brittle elegance of someone who thought she had already won. They stepped into the warmth of Eleanor's home without waiting to be invited. "Mother," Jonathan began carefully, "we came to talk. The freezing of the trust funds has put us in a very difficult position." Eleanor closed the door slowly and faced them. "What isn't fair?" "Jonathan, is being told I don't belong at Christmas. What isn't fair is hearing that I am unwelcome at my own granddaughter's wedding, when the very roof over your head, the ground beneath your feet, and the money for that wedding all come from your father and me. I carried this family, and now I'm told I'm disposable. Claire stepped forward. Eleanor, no one is saying you're disposable. It's just, this wedding is supposed to reflect us, our vision. Sometimes traditions need to change, and frankly, your presence, it can be complicated. Complicated, Eleanor repeated, her voice sharp. Is that what you call me now? Complicated? Jonathan interjected quickly. Please, let's not turn this into a fight. We came because we want to resolve this peacefully. But the fact remains, we can't move forward unless the funds are released. Eleanor's eyes narrowed. Then perhaps you should reconsider how much you value my place in this family. Because without me, there is no wedding, not the way you've planned it. The silence that followed was heavy. Claire's lips pressed into a thin line, her cheeks flushed with irritation. Jonathan rubbed the back of his neck, caught between his mother and his wife. Finally, Eleanor walked to the mantel and picked up a framed photograph. It was of Jonathan as a boy, grinning with missing teeth, sitting on his father's shoulders. She held it out for him to see. Do you remember this day? She asked. Jonathan nodded slowly. Yes, it was the fairground. Dad won me that stuffed bear. And who do you think made sure you had clean clothes that morning? Who packed the picnic? Who kept this house together so your father could take you there without worry? It was me, Jonathan. Always me. And now you stand here and allow someone else to tell me I no longer belong, that I should be silent, invisible. Jonathan's shoulders sagged. For a moment, Eleanor thought she saw guilt flicker across his face, but Claire was quick to step in again. This isn't about the past, Eleanor. It's about the future. Families evolve. We're trying to build something new, something modern, something that doesn't always have to include. She trailed off, realizing her words were sharper than intended. Doesn't have to include me, Eleanor finished coldly. The fire popped in the hearth, punctuating her words. Jonathan cleared his throat, desperate to regain control. Mom, please, we want you there. But things are tense. We need to set boundaries. If you could just release the funds. Eleanor's patience snapped. Her voice rose, strong and unwavering. No, Jonathan, you do not get to erase me while demanding I pay for my erasure. I will not release anything until I am guaranteed my rightful place at Christmas, at the wedding, and in this family. You cannot have it both ways. Claire turned sharply to Jonathan. Are you going to let her hold us hostage like this? Eleanor's eyes blazed. Hostage, that's what you call a mother demanding respect. You have mistaken my kindness for weakness. But make no mistake, I am stronger than you think. The tension in the room grew unbearable. The snow outside pressed against the windows, muting the world, as though even nature was holding its breath. At last, Jonathan sighed. Mom, please, don't do this. Not tonight. Eleanor set the photograph back on the mantel. Her voice was softer now, though no less firm. Then leave. Think about what kind of family you want to be. But until you decide that I matter, the trust remains closed. Merry Christmas. Jonathan hesitated, but Claire tugged at his sleeve. Together, they walked out the door, their silence louder than any words. Eleanor closed the door behind them, her hand steady on the knob. When she turned back to the fire, her heart ached, but her spirit felt lighter. For the first time in weeks, she knew she had chosen dignity over silence. She had drawn a line that could not be crossed. As the clock chimed midnight, ushering in Christmas Day, Eleanor whispered to herself, they may think I am alone. But this house, this legacy, and my strength, all of it still belongs to me. And with that, she sat down, listening to the fire crackle, knowing the battle was far from over, but that she had claimed the first victory. Snow held the city in a cautious quiet the morning after Christmas. Eleanor woke to a pale blue light and the smell of coffee. Resolve, not sleep, had steadied her. On the kitchen table, the Hill family trust papers lay neatly stacked like a hand of winning cards. She slid them into her leather tote and listened to the muted world outside, tires hissing on slush, a crow on the wire, a child's laugh skidding over a sled. It sounded like a life she still belonged to. At 8:14 a.m., the venue manager called, voice professional but frayed. Mrs. Hill, we attempted the reception balance for Miss Claire Hill. The transfer decline disbursement is on hold. It is, Eleanor said. Please don't cancel yet. The account holder will be in touch by week's end. She ended the call and stood in the warm, breathing silence of the house. Today she would stop negotiating with panic. If anyone wanted answers, they would ask her, not about her. At 10:03 a.m., a hatchback door shut outside. Not Jonathan's sedan, not Vanessa's SUV. Claire stood on the porch, cheeks pink, hair tucked in a knit kappa, Bocala's bride without armor. Eleanor opened the door before the bell. "Come in, sweetheart. It smells like Christmas in here," Claire said, stepping into the light. "It always does." They sat at the scarred oak table, steam curling from 2 mugs. Silence stretched until Claire whispered, "I didn't want to send that note. Dad and Vanessa said it would be simpler. They said you'd make it about you. And what do you say?" Claire's eyes filled. "That I was a coward," she breathed, shaky but honest. "When the venue called Dad this morning and he said, 'Your grandmother froze the funds,' I realized I was more afraid of losing you than of upsetting them." Eleanor laid her palm over Claire's cold fingers. "You haven't lost me," she said, "but I won't pay to be erased." "I know," Claire nodded. "That's why I came. Not to ask for money," she swallowed. "To ask for you." Eleanor had prepared for arguments, not humility. "Then tell me what you want, truly." "I want you there," Claire said, and the honesty unspooled. "Front row. A photo in the chapel garden like when I was 8 and you let me hold the lilies. Your lemon cake at rehearsal. Your story about dancing in the kitchen because there wasn't money for lessons. I want you to cry at the vows and not pretend you didn't." She laughed wetly. "I want my grandmother." "I've never pretended well," Eleanor said. "I know." Claire tried to smile, then winced. "But there's a problem. Vanessa told the coordinator you weren't coming. She said not to include you on the program. And Dad tried to add himself as secondary approver without my consent," Eleanor said evenly. "Mr. Whitman blocked it," Claire said. "Dad was furious. He said if you loved me, you wouldn't make it so hard." "Love isn't ransom," Eleanor said. "It's the tug back to your better self even when it stings." Claire's voice dropped. "Then tug me back. Tell me what to do." Eleanor set a leather folder between them. "I moved enough for final payments into escrow yesterday. Release requires 2 signatures, mine and yours. If you sign that you want me there, not barred, not hidden, I'll release it today." Claire blinked. "You did that?" "I did. Simple conditions," Eleanor said, tapping the document. "My name printed in the program as grandmother of the bride, a reserved front row seat next to your other grandmother, an invitation to rehearsal dinner, not the afterthought dessert table, and a 5-minute toast, if I choose. No one edits my words." "You're terrifying," Claire whispered. "I'm 81, Eleanor said. "It looks similar. One more thing," she added, sliding a small envelope across. "A check. To you. Not the wedding. Deposited after. A beginning, not a leash." Claire didn't open it. "Why?" "Because I want you to step into your life with something that is yours," Eleanor said. "And because my gifts won't be turned into weapons by people who confuse control with care." Claire stood and hugged her heart, like the child who used to fling herself into that same lap after scraped knees. Eleanor closed her eyes and let the scent of winter and hotel soap etch itself into her heart. When they parted, Claire signed with a decisive stroke. "Done," she said. "I'll fix the program today. I'll call the coordinator and tell them to ignore anything Vanessa said. I'm the bride." Her voice steadied. "I'm the bride." They worked an hour in gentle triage. Eleanor phoned Mr. Whitman to authorize release upon receipt of the revised program. Claire texted the coordinator, photographer, and baker. The title grandmother of the bride slid into layouts where a blank space had waited. At noon, the front door opened without a knock. Jonathan stood in the foyer, snow in his hair, panic on his face. "Mom, Claire, what are you doing?" Vanessa said the venue called. "She said you were." He stopped at the sight of the folder open and Claire's capped pen. "It's handled," Claire said, crisp as frost. "Grandma's releasing the funds, and she's coming to the wedding." Jonathan looked from daughter to mother, as if the language had changed overnight. "Claire, we talked." "Your stepmother is not the bride," Claire said. "I am." She slipped the envelope into her coat. "This is between me and Grandma." Jonathan's jaw worked. Beneath the bluster lived a man who looked suddenly, deeply tired. "Mom," he asked softly, "why do you always make it a test?" "Because love without truth is theater," Eleanor said, "and I am too old for stagehands." She nodded at Claire. "Your daughter remembered who she is. You can, too." Jonathan stood very still. Some defense unclenched. "All right," he said. I'll tell Vanessa to correct the program. No need, Claire said. I already have. Jonathan's laugh was small. He shook his head like a man stepping off a wrong path. Okay. He kissed Claire's temple, then looked at Eleanor. Mom, will you sit with me at the rehearsal dinner? Surprise flared and softened into gratitude. I will, she said. By late afternoon, escrow confirmed, and the venue manager called back with new brightness. Mrs. Hill, everything is in order. And your name is in the program as requested. Thank you, Eleanor said, and when she hung up, the house seemed to exhale. Somewhere, a radio struck up an old carol. The melody threaded the room like ribbon. Claire pulled on her cap and paused at the door. Will you wear the blue brooch? The one Grandpa gave you? I was thinking I might, Eleanor said, touching the velvet box on the hall table. Good, Claire smiled. The smile of a woman who has finally chosen. See you at rehearsal. The door closed. Eleanor kept her palm on the wood a moment, feeling the grain and the old, steady strength beneath it. Then she turned back to the table and tucked the folder away. Power, she thought, isn't loud. It's the steady hand that signs when the moment is right and refuses when it isn't. Outside, the snow shifted to a glittering drift. Tomorrow, she would sit in the front row. Tomorrow, she would watch a girl she loved say yes to a life. And tomorrow, when the music swelled and laughter rose and the photograph clicked, Eleanor Hill would be exactly where she belonged. The rehearsal dinner was warm light against a frostbitten evening. Eleanor arrived in her navy wool coat, the blue brooch pinned high and steady at her collar. Inside the hall, laughter swirled with the clink of cutlery. She paused on the threshold, a woman who had once feared exile, now walking into her place without apology. Claire spotted her first. She darted across the room in satin and sneakers, gripping Eleanor's hand as if anchoring herself to truth. You came, she whispered, though she had asked for this, fought for this. Of course I came, Eleanor said. It's where I belong. At the head table, Jonathan rose awkwardly. Vanessa remained seated, stiff smile plastered, but Jonathan gestured to an empty chair beside him. Eleanor walked the aisle of tables, guests turning, whispers flaring, until she sat down calm, visible, undeniable. The chair no longer waited empty. Through dinner, stories spilled like good wine. Eleanor described how Claire once staged a wedding between two garden gnomes, insisting on a cake made of cornbread muffins. The hall erupted with laughter, and even Jonathan's shoulders shook. Claire's eyes shimmered, not with shame, but with joy. When dessert plates were cleared, the coordinator tapped her glass. Our bride's grandmother has asked to say a few words. Eleanor stood. The room hushed. I won't speak long, she began. Her voice, clear and seasoned, needed no microphone. A wedding is a promise, but not just between two people. It's also a promise from family. To stand, to witness, to hold steady when storms bend the branches. Claire is my granddaughter, not my investment. My love cannot be revoked or reassigned. It is hers. She paused. The quiet was full. Tomorrow, when she walks down that aisle, I will cry. Not because I am losing her, but because I am proud she chose to carry love with courage. And that, Eleanor said, smiling at Claire, is all a grandmother could hope for. Applause rose, unforced and alive. Claire hurried to hug her again, and the hall felt less like a battlefield, more like a home. Later, outside beneath lanterns strung across snow-dusted branches, Jonathan caught Eleanor's arm. Mom, he said, voice raw, I've been hard on you. Maybe because you never stopped holding us to a higher bar. Maybe because you wanted to lower it, Eleanor answered gently. He exhaled. Maybe. But tonight I saw. You were right. She needed you. His eyes flicked to the windows, glowing with laughter. I did too. Eleanor touched his cheek, as she had when he was small. Then, let's stop pretending we're enemies. The next day, winter sunlight spilled through the chapel's stained glass. Claire, radiant, took her first steps down the aisle. Eleanor sat front row, brooch gleaming, tissues ready. When Claire's eyes lifted, they met her grandmother's, steady and luminous as a star. The vows were spoken, the rings exchanged, and when the kiss sealed the promise, Eleanor wept as she had promised she would, openly, unapologetically, with joy. Cameras flashed, music swelled, and generations wove themselves back together. Later, when the photograph was printed, the one with Claire between Jonathan and Eleanor, Vanessa slightly off to the side, it would hang in Eleanor's hallway, proof that love, when claimed with truth, leaves a legacy stronger than resentment. On the back of the photo, Eleanor wrote in careful script, "Love is not a bribe, nor a threat. It is a presence." And I was present. She smiled, folded the pen away, and let the house fall quiet again, no longer heavy with fear but humming with memory. For the first time in weeks, Eleanor Hill slept soundly.